We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
At the birth of the United States, the Declaration of Independence affirmed the principles and intentions of the country's founders. But when the nation was born, these principles applied almost exclusively to tax-paying, property-owning white men. Only they were guaranteed suffrage, the right to vote. The majority of the population could not participate in the government, but that would change.
The suffrage movement in this country was inevitable. Women were not going to sit there and not have the right to vote forever.
I'm on my way.
The struggle for women's suffrage in the United States was nothing less than a social revolution. It challenged the established roles of men and women and held the government accountable to the principles on which the country had been founded: liberty and equality for all. Yet few Americans are aware of the effort that the struggle for women's suffrage entailed.
When I went to college, there was one sentence in my text. It said women were given the vote. Not only did it ignore the entire history, it chose the wrong verb. You know, women weren't given the vote. We fought for the vote.
I'm on my way, Lord God Almighty. I'm on my way, good Lord.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights.
This rewrite of the Declaration of Independence was a product of the first Women's Rights Convention in the United States. It was the brainchild of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. Stanton, married to a prominent anti-slavery reformer, was committed to women's rights from an early age. Mott was a Quaker and Reform veteran. In 1848, they chose Stanton's hometown of Seneca Falls, New York, as the site for their meeting.
The general consensus is 1848, July, Seneca Falls, New York, begins the women's rights movement in the United States.
The Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 has its importance in being the first moment when women met publicly and said, "We will have our rights."
Though Stanton and Mott initiated the women's rights movement in the United States, their alliance originally began with a shared commitment to abolitionism. This reform movement attracted many men and women who believed that slavery was an abusive and unethical institution. Eager to play active roles in the cause, Stanton and Mott sought admission to the World Anti-Slavery Conference in London in 1840. But because of their sex, both were refused entrance.
This meant that you had some of the most politically active women in America sitting together in London, excluded from a discussion of slavery. So what do they discuss? Women's rights.
The important thing to understand about the initial ties between slavery and women's rights is that in the beginning, the suffragettes weren't suffragettes at all. They were abolitionists. Their initial engagement in political life came out of a profound sense of conscience. And their conscience told them that slavery was wrong. They were late in understanding that it was also wrong to deny them the right to vote.
Stanton and Mott came to recognize that just as slavery was an evil the world should no longer tolerate, women shouldn't tolerate being treated like property.
The comparison between the status of women and the status of the slave is a very tricky one because it has a lot of emotional baggage as well as legal foundation. Few white northern women lived conditions as bad as the best-kept slave in the South. And that must never be forgotten when making the comparison. There are, however, legal parallels that are worth considering.
When slaves were brought to this country, the model for their legal status was the status of women.
The 19th century woman was a prisoner in her own home. Once a woman married, she became, the legal phrase translated, dead in the law. She simply ceased to exist legally.
A woman did not own her own body, which is one of the essential definitions of slavery. She has no right to refuse sex. She cannot leave her husband without permission. She does not own the fruits of her own labor.
A husband had the right to enforce obedience of his wife as long as he did not inflict permanent injury. And to interfere was to upset the domestic tranquility of the home.
With so few personal privileges, the idea of women laying claim to any rights seemed preposterous. And yet, by the mid-19th century, virtually all white men, rich or poor, had equal rights before the law. With the country expanding westward, new states entered the Union, and they offered the vote to all white men. Eastern states, fearing a loss of population, soon followed suit. But this new enthusiasm for true democracy left the majority of the population on the sidelines. Those excluded, like women, began to press for their rights. This was the pressure that led up to the morning of July 19, 1848, when 300 men and women gathered in a small chapel in Seneca Falls.
Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton called upon their reformer friends, primarily in the abolitionist movement, to come and join them.
Seneca Falls gathered up a lot of the existing sentiment and rage and desire for simple human equality and made a clear set of demands.
Stanton, together with other leaders, drafted what they called the Declaration of Sentiments, which outlined women's grievances and proposed ways to resolve those injustices.
The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries on the part of the man toward woman.
Resolved that man is woman's equal and that she should be recognized as such.
He has compelled her to submit to laws in the formation of which she had no voice.
Lucretia Mott said, "Not every man is a tyrant, but the law gives every man the right of tyranny."
The convention accepted all of the resolutions unanimously. All but one.
Voting rights is said to be the one resolution at Seneca Falls that almost didn't pass. Some people believed it was so far-fetched that it would make a mockery of everything else.
Voting, that was really a very radical view at that point in time.
Still, Stanton argued that women could only be considered true and equal citizens of the United States if they were granted the same rights as the rest of its citizens. The resolution ultimately found an important supporter, Frederick Douglass.
We hold woman to be justly entitled to all we claim for man. There can be no reason in the world for denying to woman the exercise of the elective franchise.
The whole notion of a man who had been a slave coming forward to speak for the rights, Seneca Falls, essentially of white women, was, it seems to me, one of the great moments in American history.
Swayed by Douglass's impassioned plea, the voting rights resolution passed.
It makes perfect sense. You're trying to transform the way law treats women, and in order to transform law, you need a political voice. In order to have a political voice, you need the vote. The perfect formula.
In 1851, a strong new voice joined the struggle for women's suffrage, Susan B. Anthony. An unmarried teacher and Quaker, Anthony had strong moral convictions and participated in the abolitionist movement. She and Stanton would soon become allies. At a time when most women kept their opinions to themselves, Stanton and Anthony did just the opposite. Over the next 10 years, Stanton drafted speeches, while Anthony traveled from town to town, inspiring many women to join in the struggle for women's rights.
Anthony and Stanton became public figures at a time when it was against the law for women to speak in public, so you can imagine that this was rare.
Stanton and Anthony were very popular speakers. Thousands and thousands of Americans heard them.
This was a period when a coalition of anti-slavery and women's rights advocates worked side by side to gain universal civil rights for all Americans. But their campaign, along with most everything in the United States, came to a halt in 1861 when war erupted between the North and the South, a civil war. For 4 long years, the country was torn apart as the war called into question the institution of slavery and the nation's future. And women's suffrage was put on hold. By the war's end in 1865, the country's priorities were focused on changing the Constitution to outlaw slavery.
The urgency of making sure the war ends slavery is so all-consuming that it's hard to insist that an anti-slavery movement and a women's rights movement be sort of co-equals when one of the great changes of the Western world is dawning.
Slavery in the United States was finally abolished with the passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution.
A strong women's rights supporter said the door of freedom has swung open and the woman and the Negro will walk through it arm in arm. That didn't happen. The Negro man walked through by himself.
Ratified in 1866, the 14th Amendment guaranteed black men the right to vote.
The Constitution had been gender neutral until this point. It had never mentioned sex as a condition for citizenship. And now, for the first time, it did.
Putting male in the Constitution was to say it is okay for states to bar women.
Many Southern states, still stinging from the abolition of slavery, passed laws to circumvent the 14th Amendment. And in response, Congress readied another amendment. This time, they would try and protect the voting rights of black men by explicitly barring discrimination on the basis of race. Suffragists pushed to get their rights included in this new 15th Amendment. They felt that this was going to be their chance. But instead of becoming a great unifying moment, it drove a wedge through the movement itself.
Out of this coalition, if you will, that had been working for women's rights and African American rights for 30 years at least, and now they were separated.
There's the group that says, let's be practical and go with the 15th Amendment, not protest it so that black men can vote. But then there was the other group who said, oh, no. We don't want the 15th Amendment to be passed because we feel that that will then throw women back many decades in getting the right to vote.
Even Frederick Douglass asked women to accept the 15th Amendment as proposed.
On top of asking the country to adjust to freedom and equality for slaves, Douglass knew good and well that they were not about to give the vote to women as well. He knew that as a practical matter, it could not happen.
Stanton, Anthony, and their followers rejected Douglass's plea. They opposed the 15th Amendment, believing it was an enormous step backwards. They spent months leading petition drives and lobbying Congress. but the 15th Amendment passed as written, ignoring women.
The 15th Amendment was a terrible, terrible disappointment to them. It created one more group that was allowed into the boys' club.
After the amendment's passage, there stood two distinct branches of the suffrage movement that wanted nothing to do with each other. One branch believed that trying to change the country all at once was impractical. They decided to build support for a women's suffrage amendment by developing local support and organizations state by state. Stanton and Anthony ridiculed this strategy. As citizens of the United States, they believed that the Constitution already guaranteed women the right to vote. And to prove it in court, they urged their supporters to attempt something shocking. They should try and vote.
They were going to go to the registration booths and register to vote and say, I'm a U.S. citizen. Here's my proof I'm a citizen. I own property. Here's my proof. I'm a citizen. I pay taxes. Here's my proof. So I want the right to vote.
One activist from Missouri gave them their chance. Virginia Minor sued the government when she was turned away from the polls and managed to get her case heard before the United States Supreme Court. In 1875, the court ruled against Minor and in favor of a state's right to prohibit women from voting.
When that decision came down, it was so absolute, it was so, this case is settled now and forever, that it was clear that women would not have equal rights protected in the United States of America without a constitutional amendment.
Stanton and Anthony, especially Stanton, were incensed because black men who had been slaves in the South had gained the right to vote. And it was a very class-oriented thing. These poor, ignorant black men, they're not better than we are. We are educated white women from wholesome, good families. We should have the right to vote. How dare they want to vote and we can't vote?
Perhaps blinded by their outrage, Stanton and Anthony gave in to prejudice. Needing to attract more supporters from every part of the country to the cause, including the South, they developed alliances with socially conservative women.
Susan B. Anthony, she looks on the horizon to see who has the most power here, who can I join forces with that will bring in the greatest number.
White racist women came into the movement and began to make racist arguments for the vote. Unforgivable arguments, you know, that you have to have educated white women to make up for the uneducated black vote. Awful.
And if you read the proceedings in the history of women's suffrage, you can see the name calling. Stanton called black women Dinah, and she called black men Sambo. You call somebody Sambo, that's almost like using the N-word, especially in the 19th century.
Anthony and Stanton's single-minded devotion to the cause of votes for women led them to make these questionable choices. They didn't consider themselves racist. They believed they were merely being pragmatic. And pragmatism eventually had its benefits. In 1890, they put aside their differences with other suffrage leaders, and the fractured movement reunited to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association, the NAWSA. The cause of women's suffrage was reborn with new purpose, direction, and a new generation of women.
The second generation of suffragists were different human beings because the first generation of suffragists created a different world that they would inhabit. They created a world in which their daughters had a sense of their own worth.
These more modern women sought an end to child labor. They wanted drug legislation, and they wanted to curb political corruption. but they had little influence and no political power. The only way to effect real change was to get the vote.
The suffrage movement expands its reach into more and more corners of society. You eventually end up with stenographers for women's suffrage, laundry workers for women's suffrage. You eventually have at least tapped into lots of different sectors of society.
And by the turn of the 20th century, the movement could finally claim some victories. In the West, states like Colorado, Utah, Idaho, and Wyoming passed amendments to their state constitutions enfranchising women. While on the East Coast, in an effort to change public opinion, the suffrage movement took to the streets. By the early 1900s, suffrage groups organized parades that attracted thousands of participants, press coverage, and important public support.
They've broken through something in their minds about being public figures and using the public spaces to make their demands in a way that they weren't in the 19th century.
The suffragists did something very intelligent from a tactical point of view that we should remember now. I often say this in meetings, we should do this, which is that they shadowed all the public events of the establishment, because they understood that the press was there anyway, the crowds were there anyway, so they would not only form their own parades, but shadow the establishment parades and come along with suffrage signs and so on.
Though the suffrage movement was finally beginning to gain momentum and public support at home, international events soon took center stage. President Woodrow Wilson urged neutrality as war swept across Europe. But 3 years later, provoked by German hostility, Wilson committed the United States to the conflict. Ironically, though the Civil War had stalled the suffrage movement, this time a war would propel the movement forward.
It's interesting how war can sometimes refocus protest. And it's often for political reasons. So people who were protesting against the government felt, well, we need to really stop doing that for now and get behind the government in this war effort.
In fact, suffragists, along with many young women, took the place of men in the nation's factories. But there were a few radicals who refused. These women were influenced by the extreme wing of the British suffrage movement, which used civil disobedience as a weapon, organizing mass demonstrations and disrupting the House of Parliament to get their message heard. Throughout the war, radical American suffragists pressed the government for the vote, often suffering arrest, imprisonment, and physical abuse in the process. Undaunted, they picketed the White House, burnt the president's speeches, and when President Wilson talked about making the world safe for democracy, they ridiculed him as a hypocrite.
Wilson, he was, around the world talking about democracy, and that was too much. Okay, that's it, we've had it. How dare you talk about democracy anywhere when we don't have democracy here?
Finally, in 1918, President Wilson, persuaded by a combination of militant protest and political pressure from the NAWSA, gave his support to women's suffrage.
We have made partners of women in this war. Shall we admit them only to a partnership of sacrifice and suffering, and not to a partnership of privilege and of right?
Wilson's endorsement was an encouraging step towards changing the Constitution. But it wasn't until the end of the war a few months later that the final push could begin. As men returned from serving their country, women too felt like they had done their part and were now owed a political voice. Playing up their crucial role in the nation's war effort, suffragists made sure that their demand could no longer be ignored. Women from across the country worked in shifts to pressure members of Congress. Their goal? To build support for a constitutional amendment.
The women's engagement with the legislative process is just worlds apart by that time from anything that Susan B. Anthony had tried in the 1850s. They are some of the major lobbyists in America at that point.
You have people like Ida B. Wells in Illinois who mobilize the Black community by going door to door to get people to register to vote and to support Oscar DePriest, who becomes the first Black congressman elected in the state of Illinois. And once he's elected, the women said, okay, you know who got you elected? We got you elected. So now you have to work for us.
In 1919, Congress approved the 19th Amendment, specifically giving women the right to vote. But before the amendment could become law, 36 states had to ratify it. And the following summer, the passage of women's suffrage came down to a single vote in a single state: Tennessee.
Tennessee's very late to the women's suffrage movement. That is not where you wanted this vote to end up. And famously, anti-woman suffragists are there. They've got suites in hotels near the State House. They've got teams of people on the ground. It's a major event. The story is told that one of the younger men in the legislature thought he was going to vote against the amendment, but he conferred with his mother, and his mother directed him to cast the vote for her, and that was the one vote that carried it over.
The 19th Amendment, giving all women over the age of 21 the right to vote, was officially added to the United States Constitution on August 26, 1920.
The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex.
It had been 72 years since suffragists had begun their struggle at the Seneca Falls Convention, and the efforts of countless women and men, both celebrated and anonymous, guaranteed that women's suffrage would become a reality. But the effort to fulfill the promise of the Declaration of Independence did not end with the vote. Voting was just the first step in the fight for equality.
I think they didn't understand what we currently understand about the limits of law to make changes, and so that they would be surprised at how many things didn't change because women got the right to vote.
More than half a century after the passage of the 19th Amendment, women are still fighting for the recognition that they are just as capable and deserving as men. And an equal rights movement continues to this day.
Are we going to march? Yes!
I'm going to make a button that says, "The truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off."
Are we going to win? Yes!
This right now, what we are doing right now, to tell young people that being good and waiting to be treated fairly is not what has worked historically. That you've had to be twice as good and fight to get an equal status is absolutely crucial.
Just like the Founding Fathers, the women we call suffragists were revolutionaries. They challenged their government and the country to change its view of the role of women in society.
The revolution that they effected was a change in the thinking of America. They created conditions where women were understood to be equal participants in the human drama. That's a revolution that's extraordinary.
The suffrage movement in a country that began with the Declaration of Independence, declaring that all men were created equal, was bound to happen. The analogy from men to women is pretty easy to draw when you're talking in freedom terms. The suffrage movement was as inevitable in our country as the decline and fall of slavery. It could not stand, and it did not stand.